Hey everyone, welcome to this latest IWA webinar, Cleaner Rivers, which is brought to you in partnership with WWF Cymru. I'm Joe Rossiter and I'm co-director at the Institute of Welsh Affairs, or the IWA. The IWA is Wales's leading independent think tank, and we have a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through our policy research, our advocacy, and our online and print publications, which provide platforms for robust comment and debate, and our agenda-setting events. We're also a membership organisation with organisational and individual members from across Wales and beyond. If you'd like to know more about what we do and support us, please join us as a member and help shape Wales's future with us. Now, today's event is part of our series that we've been delivering ahead of the Senedd elections in partnership with WWF Cymru. We've been set this series out to discuss the 4 focus areas that have been outlined in WWF Cymru's Senedd election manifesto. These are healthier seas, greener jobs in the economy, fairer food and farming, and today's topic, which is cleaner rivers. So you can listen back to us on healthier seas, and the economy webinar is available to watch back. Both are really interesting discussions on really important issues. So you can watch them back either on our website or on your YouTube or your podcast provider of choice. Now, before we get and bring in our speakers, bit of housekeeping. We always encourage attendees to introduce yourselves or engage with each other in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. Please use the chat function to say hello, share your email if you're willing to be contacted by other attendees, or just comment on what's happening or talk to each other. The other bit on the bottom of your screen will be the Q&A function. We'd like you to use the Q&A function if you have any questions throughout the day to our 4 panelists. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat, because they'll be picked up in the Q&A function. And also, please make sure that your questions are questions rather than statements. So statements, chat, questions in the Q&A function, please. And they'll be at the bottom of your screen as well. Please remember that all chat and questions are recorded, and we'll be keeping this to strictly an hour maximum, but please, we've left aside some chunky time for questions. So yeah, please, if anything comes up, please note your questions in the Q&A function, as I said. So recording of today's event will also be made available on both the IWA website and our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who couldn't make it, or you'd like to share the conversation with a little bit wider, then we'll be sending that across to all people who signed up for the webinar following it being put online. Okay, now on to today's conversation with housekeeping out the way. We all know that Welsh rivers are in a pretty dire state. Pollution has poisoned all too many of our waterways, and freshwater biodiversity is suffering. And I'll let our speakers go into a bit more detail of those as well. And this problem hasn't arisen overnight. It's a legacy of of environmentally damaging practices, ineffective regulation, alongside some lax monitoring and enforcement regimes as well. As Wales heads towards 2030 and the almost certainty that it will fail to meet its key water quality goals, this webinar will try and identify what actions should be taken by the next Welsh Government to clean up our waterways before it's too late. It's also an issue that is at the top of mind for communities across Wales. It's an issue that communities care deeply about, with communities taking action into their own hands to make rivers clean and safe to enjoy. So we'll unpack that a little bit as well. It's also at the forefront of the political mind at the moment. Most parties going into the Senedd elections in their manifestos are talking about river health and water quality and what they'll do to solve it. So it's clearly an issue that politicians are aware is at forefront of voters' minds and are committed to doing something about that. So, I think it's a good time to be having this conversation, maybe talk about some of the commitments in manifestos and some of what our panelists think the next Welsh Government should do to clean up our waterways. We also want to try and understand what actions are underway already to reduce pollution, what things are working, what things aren't working, and what more needs to be done in policy, regulation and funding to drive Wales towards a healthy freshwater environment in the next decade. And we've got some really good mix of speakers to talk about this as well, and different elements of this challenge. So I'm really glad that we've got this panel of speakers, because they can each give really practical experience and advice on what they think the next Welsh Government should do when it comes to this really important issue. So I'm going to introduce them now. And for the rest of the discussion, it is going to be a discussion. There's no presentations. What we really want to do is get into a discussion around some of the key issues, really, and building into and informing people about the expertise that we have on the panel. So the panel, we've got Gail Davies-Walsh, Director of Waterways Cymru, Steve Wilson, Chief Operations Officer of Welsh Water Cymru. We've got Kate Strong, who's a community leader with Taff Tidy, and we've got Rodri Lloyd-Williams, who's a farmer at Moel and Farm. Sorry, I've absolutely butchered the pronunciation there, Rodri, so you have to put me right. Okay, so we're going to start with a general question and go from there. As I said, we've got time for audience questions as well. So let's start broad. And whoever's brave and wants to go first can answer this question. You can build on the back of it. We hear an awful lot about the state of our rivers in the media. Can you tell us about what your experiences of Welsh rivers, what is causing the issues, and how these change in different parts of Wales, really? So what's the state of our rivers in Wales? Who wants to go first?
Oh, that'll be me then. Okay, so I generally, the National Reporting for Wales says that 40% of our rivers are in good ecological status. That's based on the Natural Resources Wales's monitoring programme. What we have is 7 out of our 9 internationally designated SAC rivers failing, however, against the standards that have been set for them. And we have a whole mix of different impacts to our rivers, whether that is from wastewater, agricultural impacts, industrial impacts, and it's really variable across Wales. So we've clearly got areas where actually we've had improvements in our rivers and we've seen some ecological improvements, and that's generally the industrial rivers of Wales, where we had significant coal mines and old industrial type impacts, and those have actually, we've seen an improvement in those as those industries have closed down, but that's flattening now. And then we just have geographical variation with significant agricultural impact in the west, and on the sort of border rivers, and then a host of other issues, which I'm sure others will come on to, around things like litter and pharmaceuticals and chemicals.
Anyone else want to give their perspective?
Yeah, I'll sort of just sort of endorse what Gail has kind of said. That 40% meeting good ecological status, we're not happy with that. We want to see this even better, but we do need to put this a bit into perspective. That figure is nearer 14% in England. Wales is in a better place. The European average is somewhere in the kind of mid-30s%. But clearly there are places we want to aspire to be like. Scotland has over 60% of its rivers meeting good ecological status. So it's a really important benchmark that we should continue to look at and drive to it to improve.
Anyone else, Kate or Rodri?
I wanted to touch a little bit on that. I think we're very quick. I'm pivoting the conversation slightly, if that's all right, Joe. Pull me back if not. It's my default. I think we're very quick to blame and point the fingers at these bad actors, people who are polluting or organisations that are polluting our river. But we forget this. It's a story of all of us participating in that system. So we have this data, but can we bring in that? Rivers aren't just something out there in the ether. We are part of nature. So when a river is polluted, we are polluting ourselves as well. And we are complicit in that pollution, even in our inertia. So I do think we need to remember that the natural world isn't just a resource to protect. It's been doing pretty well before the humans were on this planet. It's also something for us to honour as much as to stop polluting and restore as well. And I just want to sort of say we all need to play our role individually as well as collectively. We can't just keep jumping to blame the water companies if and when they fail, we flush things down the toilet that the system was never designed to handle, such as chemicals and wet wipes. And we might be frustrated with agricultural pollution, but we demand the cheap food that puts pressure and on sustainable practices being financially impossible. So we need to have that uncomfortable truth of saying that we're not just victims of the system, we're part of it. And that isn't a bad thing. We can take agency within that.
Thanks. Good points, Kate. So on the back of that, we kind of rough guide of how we're doing, but because we've got a kind of generalist audience as well, what are the impacts of, of river pollution as you see them, whether they're personal, financial, environmental, or community? Maybe you're a good person to start on that, Kate.
Well, personally, I'm a former athlete. We're seeing more and more people who are actually getting involved in rivers through it recreational, for our mental health. We're at the risk of being ill. Like I'm a former triathlete, so we're seeing triathletes who are training in or competing in World Triathlon Series. I mean, this was in Wales, in England, in Sunderland. They got ill. So we're actually now sort of disconnecting from the river. We're risking our personal health. But on a wider scale, what I'm quite concerned about is people are just spending less time next to the rivers, which means they care less, they're seeing the waste less. And that means that individually, we're probably going to pollute more because we don't see the impact of our own personal actions.
Anyone else want to come in on the impact that they see?
Probably say something I haven't seen anything, have I? Yeah, I'm sort of conscious I'm the only one on the panel really who's not sort of an expert in rivers, and I only have knowledge of the little river that runs through the middle of my farm. But because it's always been there and I've sort of grown up swimming in it, playing in it, paddling in it, fishing in it as a kid, and I'm drinking out of it. I'm not sure that's a very scientific test of your river, but I've drunk out of it, that river, all my life, and we're lucky, I suppose, there's no one upstream of us, so it's only our pollution that's going to be an issue. But yeah, as far as the farming's concerned, you sort of look at impacts as far as for me as a farmer, anything that goes into my river as a nutrient, be that soil, be that, and we're an organic farm, so we don't put fertilizer down, but be that manure, anything goes off my land into the river. Obviously, it's detrimental to the river, but it's also a financial cost to me. So I think, as in, I want to keep fertility on my land, and I want to keep being able to grow crops on what is quite a hard hill farm. So I think we can sort of reframe the message sometimes with all of these things. There's a detriment to the river with things going into them. But there's also a detriment to farming systems if we're losing that fertility, and certainly soil runoff is a huge issue. But yeah, and so I think there's ways of reframing things that can encourage people, as Kate has said, to make sure that we look after the rivers for a myriad of reasons.
Gail, did you want to come in?
Well, yeah, I think, the sort of rivers are a really important part of Welsh landscapes and Welsh heritage. And some of the work that we do has looked at how our rivers sort of connect the communities together that live on them and have built around them. And that's really important. And what I see at the minute is a real sort of increase in people connecting with their local rivers and their understanding of where that river is and what it means to them. And Kate and Roger are right. It's really clear that river water quality and river flow, which is often forgotten at the minute, but is really important. It is so intrinsically linked to all of these communities. We've had some real ups and downs in our climate recently, whether that's 2022 or last year with very dry weather in Wales, but we also had a huge number of frequent floods, and that really brings people's understanding of what a river means, whether they're directly working with the river or living next to a river or just in a community that is actually being impacted one way or the other.
And if we stick with you, Gail, you've obviously worked on the detail of river pollution, and really, what do you see as some of the solutions to river pollution?
So I think the green paper for water reform has been published recently by Welsh Government, and that was a consultation as to how we should take things forward. And I think there were some really important things for everyone to think about in that paper, because we sort of lost our way a little bit in how we managed our rivers. We put in a lot of artificial boundaries between different organisations. We stopped looking at them as catchments, and we stopped thinking, I think, about all of the ways that everybody uses the river. And we need to bring that back together again in order to move forward on the solutions. So there's lots of good work going on. I represent the Rivers Trusts in Wales, and they've had a long history of doing work on rivers, specifically for river restoration, to support fisheries in Wales, which are in massive decline. And that's been things like removal of barriers and habitat restoration work on rivers. But we've really got to separate each of the individual sources and impacts of pollution to rivers whilst we're thinking about those solutions. So there's lots of really good work going on in Wales around the implementation of nature-based solutions. And that's to do things like the work that Rodri is supporting around planting trees and holding flow and flow attenuation and storage in catchments, which is one element of that. We've got to be really clear that we separate pollution from just general resilience impacts, because we do have some deliberate sort of pollution of rivers in Wales that we really need to sort of control through regulation and enforcement. And that's a really important element of sorting out a solution alongside all of the other active work that we can do.
And Rodri, I'll maybe go to you in a second about what we mean by nature-based solutions, because I think it's really important to kind of understand what that means practically in terms of what it is. But to stick with you, Gail, and I guess it was brought up in the Green Paper from Welsh Government. But what is the role of governance and enforcement here? Is that kind of really needing to be strengthened? Can we see some of the failings of where we are now as a result of lack of enforcement or
Yeah, absolutely, because our policies and our legislation is only as good as its enforcement of it. And we can look at all the areas where there's gaps in legislation, and there's lots of proposals to bring in new legislation, but if we are not enforcing the legislation that we've got, then actually it almost becomes a pointless paper exercise. And I think what we had really was a period of quite poor enforcement and regulation in Wales. Some of that is to do with a lack of capacity in our regulators to sort of implement that, but it's also a sort of like a lack of technical understanding of what was going wrong on our rivers, and that directly links back to our understanding of that and whether we're monitoring the right things in the right place.
And Steve, you're just to bring you in on that. You're quite a regulated sector yourself. So, what's your kind of take on the governance challenge?
I think Gail set it out pretty well. We are heavily regulated, and rightly so. But the challenge that we have is not one of trying to do the wrong thing. It's trying to do the right thing, but recognizing that in Wales we have, as Gail mentioned, 9 of the 16 UK SAC rivers. We've got a third of the UK's blue flag beaches on 15% of the coastline. But we have less than 5% of the UK's population to pay the bill for all that infrastructure. And water and wastewater infrastructure is phenomenally expensive. Moving water about costs a lot of money. I know it all falls from the sky, and our Victorian forefathers have been fantastic at building, reservoirs, pipe systems, sewer systems. But, we need to remember that, Welsh Water's bills are some of the highest because at the point of privatisation, there was no sewage treatment around the coast of the UK. And you think about the populations of Wales, Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Bangor, you go around the north coast, all that just used to go out to sea untreated. And it's only in the 90s that all that infrastructure was built to start to tackle that. And that's what saw our beaches improve dramatically. And as I said, we have far more blue flag beaches in Wales as a percentage than we do in that we see in England. But now we've got to start tackling the infrastructure inland, these storm overflows, the small rural treatment works. Just about every village in Wales has got its own sewage treatment works. Now, on one hand, that's quite a good thing because great big discharges, have far more impact than smaller discharges over a greater distance. But that is the challenge. 824 sewage treatment works in our operating area, and 2,300 storm overflows. We've got more combined sewer, which is sewers which take the rainwater as well as the foul water in Wales than in England. So the costs of tackling all this has to be borne by customers, by society. There is nowhere else that this money is coming from. There's no government subsidy. So it's the pace at which we can deliver these improvements at an affordable rate for our customers. Wales is not, has some of the most deprived areas of deprivation in the UK. We've got to do this at a pace that our customers can afford, and we've just seen bills go up dramatically in this, for the 5-year period we've just started, our investment period. And again, to try and bring that to life, in the last 5-year period, so 2020 to 2025, we were spending about £350 million on environmental improvements that we had agreed with Natural Resources Wales to deliver. So tighter permit standards, tackling some of those treatment works which were having an impact on rivers. That's gone up to nearly, it's £1.2 billion that we're spending in this 5-year period, 1,200 million pounds, a huge step up in terms of number of schemes, number of sites that we're going to be improving. But that has really increased bills. Bills for customers gone up by 20-odd%. And we can, we're engineers and scientists, we can go faster, harder, but society will have to pay for that. So that's where actually that green solution piece that Gail mentioned and that Rodri's been so heavily involved in is something we've got to keep coming back to here. That's got to be the USP for Wales. How can we do this in a more green, nature-based, sustainable way than my engineers spending time putting more concrete in the ground, more metal pipes, just trying to deal with climate change and growth.
Thanks, Steve. That's a useful context from Do Cymru as well. Now, I said I'd bring you in, Rodri, for this, and I think it's a good starting point of saying, and just to break down SAC rivers, special areas of conservation rivers in Wales, just to break down that jargon. In terms of nature-based solutions, and any of you can come in on this after Rodri's kind of set out what it might look like. What do we mean by nature-based solutions? What practically does it mean, and what kind of effects could we expect to see from using nature-based solutions? What are the impacts, Rodri?
Yeah, so I can walk through a few things we've done on our farm, but I sort of got a caveat that these were and are still sort of farming decisions. So, and I think that's again important to highlight when I was looking at making changes and the trees we put in and all these things. It was looking at a way of sort of A, future-proofing our business against potentially changing climate, and B, looking at ways of producing more from less on what is quite a hard hill farm. So yeah, I suppose the big thing we've done is over the last 20 or so years, we planted upwards of 100,000 trees on farm, and the majority of that has been in hedgerows. So in the last 4 years, we've looked at putting in sort of between 10 and 12,000 trees every winter. And that's just been initially switching what was a single fence into a double fence and planting a hedge in the middle. And then more recently putting in the sort of subdividing fields and putting hedges in between. And that's all that work's been made possible by Woodland Trust, who we sort of started a collaboration with about, as I say, 4 years ago, and have just been brilliant to work with in the sense that over the years, maybe I'm not going to go Welsh Government, but when we've been involved in agri-environment schemes in the past, it's sort of felt a bit more like you're being policed, like they would maybe sometimes look at ways of tripping us up, whereas Woodland Trust have just been a joy to work with in comparison. And they'll supply the trees and they'll help towards the cost of the fencing, and that's just made it a lot more viable. And So by doing this, the hope is by creating more fields, subdividing with the hedges and with electric fencing, we're growing more grass, doing this rotational grazing. Rotational grazing, in theory, not only you growing more grass, but you're getting deeper root depth. So you're getting greater water infiltration. So not only are the trees slowing the flow of water coming off the hills, but you're also slowing the water by getting the actual soil itself is less compacted. So you're getting more water infiltration in that way. So it's a win-win on both sides. And obviously, again, as a farmer, I want to hold on to my nutrients on land. I don't want my soil to wash out, and I don't want the water to flow off. I want to. Well, the last few summers now, we've had long droughts, and ideally, you want that good water infiltration so the roots of the plants can hold on to it. So we didn't get as much burn off, I don't think, as we might have done last summer during the drought, because we had longer sward growth from moving stock more regularly, and of course the growing hedges are going to produce shelter in the hot summers for the stock, and also in the cold, windy, snowy winters that we get up here in the hills. So we're definitely seeing benefits from that, again, for the farm, and obviously the knock-on effect is that slowing the water for the runoff into the river. So yeah, the tree planting, the rotational grazing. We used to do a lot of ploughing. As an organic farm, we plough a lot of land and reseed it with sort of clover and ryegrasses. And we've started to slow down on that a bit, because we really did notice if you plough, you can see it anywhere you go. See a ploughed field, and then you get heavy rain afterwards. You just see this big run of soil straight off the land, straight into the rivers, and that's an important thing that we need to be looking after. So we haven't stopped ploughing altogether, but we've gone from ploughing quite a lot of land every year to ploughing maybe every 4 or 5 years, and putting in herbal lays, these deeper rooted species that are hopefully going to tolerate more drought conditions. And by having more of a mixed sward, it's potentially better for the stock, but also more resilient, be it long dry summers or wetter winters or colder winters. Yeah, so it's an ongoing process. We're trying lots of different things. As I say, we're organic, so we don't get the threat of chemical runoff into our rivers. The other thing I mentioned briefly is we've recently got a biochar kiln. We're experimenting with biochar on farm because we've got all these wood going, and we're looking at ways of trying different things, and putting biochar back on the land is supposed to be very good for building soil health, building soil carbon, and it's very porous. So again, it's holding on to potentially soil runoff. So yeah, forever sort of experimenting with different things, build collaborations and sort of relationships with other people that you trust, and try things. And yeah, as I say, I'm quite proud of how our rivers look, and I'm conscious of people. We're top of the hill, there's people downstream of us. We want to look after the river, the water on our land, and also be conscious of what's flowing off it.
And obviously, this is an area where public policy has changed quite a lot in recent years with the albeit delayed launch of the Sustainable Farming Scheme, which seeks to incentivize lots of the stuff that you're doing. How confident are you that the government is doing enough to kind of support farmers who wish to improve river health and prevent, excess nutrient loss and soil loss?
I don't know how much SFS specific. I mean, it certainly mentions rivers, but I'm not sure how much it's geared towards that. But I think a lot of the policies they're bringing in potentially would, in themselves, have a positive impact on that. Looking at things we've already done, they are looking to encourage tree planting, looking to encourage herbal lays, rotational grazing, soil health being a big part of it. I think if you can look after your soils, you're automatically going to be far better looking after your rivers, because if you've got functioning soils with a sort of the microbiome in the soils doing what it should do, you get far more sort of aerobic soil. So there's space within the soil itself to hold on to water. So they're working towards that. But I think a big part of improving on these things is sort of 3-point really. You need to, as farmers, we need the knowledge to understand the impact we're potentially having, and the impact we're having, and also the benefits that we can create in the ways we farm. And then on top of that is time. The work I've been doing is very time consuming, be that if you're looking at fencing off rivers, if you're looking at infrastructure for rotational grazing or slurry storage, or any improvements along those lines, it's going to take a lot of time. And on top of the time, it's going to be the cost, so the money. So the stuff we've done, I wouldn't have done any of this without woodland trust, but it's still costing us money. I'm doing it because I think I can justify it as a business decision, with all the knock-on benefits for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water infiltration, and flood mitigation, which we'll probably go on to a bit later, maybe. But first and foremost, and I run a business, and I have to be able to justify the cost of things. So if the government can help us out on all three of those things, knowledge, the time, and the money, then I think and as I said before, reframe it as a farming decision. I know it frustrates me that there sometimes seems to be this bizarre conflict between food production and sort of environmental points of view. And it doesn't have to be like that. I'm on the steering group of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and a lot of the work they do is sort of advocating things that I'm a big advocate of. We need to be producing food in this country rather than relying on imports. And I think the geopolitical situation and climate change going forward is really highlighting that in recent times, that we need to be able to look after ourselves as a relatively small island. But at the same time, I don't think that has to be at the loss of biodiversity and polluting our rivers. I think the two things are not mutually exclusive. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and I think that message is starting to get out there. But I think collaborations is where we make progress. And I sound like an old man, but in the modern world, it seems to be you sort of get online, you pick a point of view, and you try and shout the loudest. And I think more and more the people who are getting things done are the ones that are speaking, admitting that maybe they don't know everything and they're not always right about everything, and listening and learning. And I found, the last few years, it's interesting once you open that door. It's really interesting how much you can get done in quite a short space of time.
Cool. There's lots of different jumping off points.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's excellent. Whether that's, the impact of nature-based solutions on the water treatment and flood defense system. There's also, Kate, I'm really wary of bringing you in, and there's also that kind of community response in, how can communities that live around rivers that are impacted by agricultural pollution get involved in sorting some of the solutions. And Gail, you're kind of the voice of the river themselves. So does anyone want to kind of jump off the back of what Roger's discussed on nature-based solutions?
Well, yeah,
I'll start.
Sorry,
Go on.
Kate, carry on.
Go on, Kate, and then I'll bring you in, Gail.
Sorry, Gail. Mine's more of a question as well. Firstly, it's music to my ears, Rodri, what you're saying. And, I'm attending a college at the moment to better understand soil ecology, because I think that is the root. The river is at the root of that. So how can we be more regenerative? My sort of throw out to the thoughts in what I'm playing with, because I'm nowhere near an expert, but I'm always trying to speak to communities to find out questions and explore how we can collectively find the answer. Because similar to what Steve was saying, like you've got a myriad of different communities with different needs, different wants, different services and accessibility to resources. Is there a way of each community having a community assembly to find out, using Rodri's example, what does that community need? Like a river at the source might need a different nature-based solution than one at the mouth next to the ocean or the estuary. So I think we need to decentralize the answers and bring it more community, give them access to the resources, such as these webinars and infrastructure from charities, and say, what do they want to implement, which gives us ownership as community members to then implement, but also care, respect and restore, and also bring into our own back gardens. We don't need to have acres and acres of land. What can we do in our driveways? What can we do in our backyard, which can remove the pressures on our water infrastructures, and also what's doing within our household? So I'm not really bringing an answer per se, but I'm sort of throwing out a question in how can we get more communities engaged in this conversation and take ownership on our little strip of land, even if it is just outside our front door next to our footpath.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a bit more detail, because obviously it's an issue that lots of people care an awful lot about. Gail, can you build on the back of what Kate was talking about, and Roger as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally endorse everything that Rodri says, because the reality is all of those things are directly benefiting a river. We don't need to attach the word river to it to know that that's where we're going to have. And I we live in a little bit of a mad world at the minute. I think that our rivers are failing in lots of areas of Wales for excessive nutrient levels, and at the same time, farmers are really struggling in terms of the cost of fertilizer and bringing that in, and that's ever more apparent at the minute with the sort of economic issues that we've got. So, to me, we've got a real ripe position at the minute to make a real step change here, that we need to work collaboratively to look and understand at the points where in our food system we are producing significant amounts of slurry and manure, and where actually across the UK and Wales, we're actually short of those nutrients, and whether we can do a much better job policy-wise of actually distribution of those nutrients, because I mean, it's just sort of mindless that the amounts of money that are potentially going towards removing nutrients as a symptom, rather than actually trying to focus the funds and the sort of actions on the cause, and seeing what we can do better with that management. And that absolutely involves us getting a lot more engaged with working with people and working with communities. And there's some really good examples at the minute of groups that have been set up across Wales, community groups that are supporting with things like water quality monitoring and engagement, but also separate groups. I was in West Wales yesterday, groups that are really actively driving now to look at solutions to some of these issues, and sort of joining together, if you like, the science, which is sort of providing some of the sort of academic background to why we need to do some of these things, but also really understanding how it could benefit themselves in terms of the agricultural community, as Roger absolutely said, because we can do some of this and have great benefit to farmers and agriculture, but also at the same time have a real good benefit for our rivers.
And building on the back of that, Steve, you've obviously got this this kind of mid to long term infrastructure and investment plan for Welsh Water. How much of that big, large scale investment is in nature-based solutions? What kind of projects does that look like? And what is the role of the next Welsh Government in kind of supporting and investing the use of nature-based solutions? And what are the kind of role of Welsh Water within that mix?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing. I'm trying to think. In this next 5 years, we've got about 50 or so storm overflows that we're going to be tackling, those which we know are causing real environmental impact, harm to the river. And only about 10, 15 of those are we going to be able to put a nature-based solution in. And why is that? It's a combination of some circumstances don't suit a nature-based solution. There are some urban environments where there's just not the space to put that in. But also we touched very early on about the need for enforcement, and I fully endorse the fact that where water companies and other bodies are not doing their job properly need to be held to account. But the current pressure on regulators about you need to be tougher is meaning that regulators are going, I want to be able to measure that solution is absolutely kind of working. And if you want 0.1 milligram per litre levels of phosphorus, you need to do it in a much more chemically controlled way than nature. Nature does a fantastic job, but the nervousness about actually can we measure and will it work in all circumstances is meaning that regulators are reluctant to permit nature-based solutions. And clearly I'm managing customer money here. I don't want to spend it twice. So, if we put a solution in and then it turns out that it doesn't work. So actually we've got to do this in partnership. Everything everybody has said is the right answer. And actually climate change adaptation, there's a real emergency, evolving around climate change, which, we mustn't forget about. And the nature-based solutions are fantastic at helping us adapt to that climate change. But I think it's just working with regulators to get braver in going for more nature-based solutions. And, we've got to work more in partnership with landowners, etc. to do it. So my plan is we're going to do a few schemes in this 5-year period, but I really want in the next 5-year period to make that the go-to solution that we'll prove in this period. And we've got a really interesting project, our Pontevelin nature-based solution for dealing with storm overflows up near Pontypool is in and working, and we're measuring real improvements to the Afon Fluid from the discharges from that site. And the things we've seen with nature-based solutions is they are so much better than a concrete one at adapting to climate change. Warmer weather, more intense rainfall, nature is fantastic at adapting.
Wonderful. Yeah, good to get an insight on that, Steve. Okay, going to pivot slightly to you, Kate. Really want to understand what your, individual experience of river pollution is, why you got involved in Taft Tidy and community action, and, what has been the response of the community around you around what you've been doing.
Thank you. Yeah, for those that don't know, Taft Tidy was last year one-off event that culminated in a world record. So it was the most amount of people to clean a river from the source to the sea in one sitting. And I think we cleaned nearly, I'd say 1,500 bags in half an hour of rubbish. And we had an entire spectrum of the community arrive, from people without homes, immigrants, asylum seekers, politicians, business owners, household members, students as well. So it was absolutely wonderful to see the entire spectrum of society coming out to care for our river. Why I got involved, when I walk down a river or anywhere really, it's sad to see more wet wipes in a river, in a tree, than there are leaves. It's sad to see pollution. I'm trying to dodge rubbish on the floor, and I get this is sort of looking at a micro element of the waste that we're talking about. And I'm a doer, I'm a former athlete. So I was like, well, what can I do? How can I get people engaged? How can I get people to care and have that agency? And so a litter cleanup is a great way as an entry level to start people talking about and connecting to not just the problem, but also the solution. So we can sit down and collectively say, why does the waste exist in its first instance? What is our role? Because we're not all saviors, and we're not, we're all complicit within this, as I said at the beginning. And how can we take action moving forward? So that's kind of what I did to get involved. The feedback has been incredible. There's been a lot of offshoot groups being formed, people seeing how easy it is to take action. We sometimes see the cleanup of our river as quite an enormous feat, and there's that sense of overwhelm. I don't know what I can do. Like, what can I do about such a big task? But also, how can my one action make such a big difference? But we forget that, a river is a culmination of a million tiny river drops or raindrops, such as the same as action for individuals. So again, it's that behavioural change piece, and what can we do today that's very, very small, but can actually add up over incremental stages over many years, a bigger shift. And I'm very keen in talking also about that longer term vision. What can we do that changes the behaviour and shifts within our household, how we treat our water, how we protect it, not just waste it, what we actually do with our waste and throw it away, and call that location away as a river. When we put things away, it has to go somewhere. So where is that somewhere, and how can I be responsible outside my parameter of my property? And also looking larger scale at reconnecting to nature, so the nature-based solutions that Rodri was talking about. If we stop looking at wetlands, if we stop looking at rivers or even our trees as something out there, and we see it as the resource that gives us air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat, our health mentally, physically, and emotionally, if we start owning it as something that we need that's critical to our personal life, I think people will take more action and actually be a larger voice for something that's been pretty patient with us over these decades of our pollution. So yeah, I'm just keen to always explore and find ways of getting people connected. I don't think there's one solution, but everyone doing something differently, trialing and erroring, not being afraid to make a mistake and then pivot. I think that's what we need moreover. And that's sort of where my passion lies when I'm engaging with my communities and my friends and my family as well.
Fab, thanks, Kate. Right, we're going to move on to audience questions, and I'm going to let you panelists decide who wants to take each one. So, yes, there's a few questions on that have come. A key theme is kind of how we measure um, pollution or ecological abundance of our rivers. What are the differences in how we maybe measure river health compared to the rest of the UK? Is there differences, and indeed the wider EU? And does the way that we measure river health, does the differences in that between different parts of the UK and Europe maybe mask some of the differences in how well our rivers are actually doing? Gail, you're nodding your head, so you can come in.
Damn it. Yeah, and I was going to comment on that earlier when Steve was raising that, and I think, yeah, absolutely it does. So what we have at the minute is not necessarily a very consistent approach to how monitoring is being done in the UK. So we need to be really careful when we quote numbers for Wales against where England or the other devolved countries are, because we're simply not doing the monitoring and making the assessments in the same way. One of the real key areas I've got concern about at the moment is how we monitor chemicals in Wales. And the reality, as far as I'm concerned, is that the 14% in England versus the 40% in Wales is actually just because we're monitoring chemicals differently in Wales. And sadly, if we were doing it in a similar way, I suspect our sort of status of rivers in Wales would be quite similar. So we just need to be really careful, as always, with how we deal with data and stats. We also need to sort of separate just general water quality monitoring, so all the monitoring that we do across Wales for sort of regulatory purposes and permitting of people like the water industry, against pollution, because pollution is simply, it could be a one-off event. And what we've got really good at is removing outliers from our data set and saying they're one-offs. They're too high, it's an error with the data, whereas actually what we see when we've got much more detailed monitoring programs is that actually those outliers are quite frequent in some places and therefore should actually be part of the assessments we're making. So we've got some really good activity going on at the minute. We've got some really strong citizen science groups, which is brilliant. People out and about collecting data across many of the rivers. We've also got some areas of Wales that have got nutrient management boards, and those boards have been putting in additional in-river monitors and sondes and sensors, and there's some more of those about to go out this year. So that's bringing in a lot more detailed data, and that's really good, because the more data we've got, the better understanding we've got of what the issues are, and then that can only lead to getting the solutions right.
Steve, do you want to come back on that? And I also want to pick up on and maybe Kate might want to come back on this after Steve, around that kind of community monitoring, citizen science. And, you see a lot of community members really passionate about going out and collecting data, but then maybe feel like it doesn't go anywhere. And that sense of frustration, that link to the enforcement bit again, it might be a source of frustration. But Steve, do you want to come back on that?
No, absolutely. I'm a strong believer, in that citizen science, because it's back to kind of Kate's point about we need to start to own our own environment. And so I have no problem with citizen science doing what they're kind of doing, but I think it's how we collectively, and I think the kind of main bodies here, and I'm including the regulators in this space as well as the water companies, need to make more available our data on an open platform, which we can share that citizen science data on the same. There's some really good platforms appearing now from different groups putting their data on there. But for instance, is there a lot of value in somebody, camped outside of one of my treatment works, monitoring, with their little test kits, when I've got an inline monitor on the site which is reading out all the time? If I would put that data more in the public domain, actually there are other tributaries and parts of the network where we haven't got the data that we do need to do, because, back to kind of Gail's point earlier on, it's just a reality of, government funded regulators have over time had budget reductions, and so the amount of monitoring which is going on in the environment in Wales is less than it used to be. So at a time when we probably need to understand more of what that picture is, and really improve our knowledge of how the river system is working, then we can target where those investments need to be. Because, as I said, these are big, chunky kind of costs. And the last thing I want to do is spend customers' money on something which actually isn't going to deliver the right kind of results. So I'm a big believer in citizen science, because what it means is we've got a very actively engaged community who feel ownership around that. And there's nothing better than engaged customers, because back to Kate's point, then we can have real conversations about what can we do collectively. I stood on the banks of the River Dee in Chester waiting for a BBC interview, and this lady came out. I think she was thinking that I was casing her house, lovely big house by the side of the River Dee. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, my water company are going to do this interview." So it's terrible, all these storm overflows going into the river. And I looked at her house with her blockwork drive and her plastic lawn that she'd put in at the front of her house. And I said, "Where's the water go for your property?" "It goes down that pipe." "Where does that pipe go?" "I don't know." I said, "That pipe goes into the sewer, and that sewer is being overloaded with rainwater, and that's what's causing the storm overflow spill." It's little things like that. Actually, it's about engaging more with our customers and communities about what are the little things that we can all do that help collectively. Whilst we do, I'm not getting out of the fact that we as a water company have to do a lot more, spending a lot of money here at improving an aging infrastructure.
Kate, did you want to come in on the citizen science community monitoring? Is that anything, of interest to you as, in the community space?
Yeah, I personally don't do it because I'm not out frequent enough. I'm quite transient, so I don't have I think a data set over a consistent period of time is important, and I'm definitely not consistent in any element of my life. So I'm not somebody to be contributing. I know my weaknesses. But to touch on, wouldn't it be great if the individuals and community groups that do this, who are given the equipment to measure it either by Welsh Water or charities like Surfers Against Sewerage, who give this sort of small pack out, are then put in a room with decision makers, so we can actually, in that moment, not just think about, learn about, talk about, but we can then implement. That's the power. And that little element there is sometimes a bit missing. And I think that disenchants communities to have, again, I love imagination sort of games. Imagine a group of individuals who have consistently and diligently been connecting to the rivers, put in touch with local farmers and residents and members of the companies nearby, as well as somebody from the government who can implement legislation and or give legal advice if it's valid or otherwise, and Welsh Water and other key stakeholders. And during that hive mindset, decisions are made that all are in agreement that this can work for us all longer term. You've then got a long-term buy-in that can be implemented straight off the back. That's the little element that we're not seeing consistently. And I don't know how to implement that, but I'd be pretty game to give it a good go if we got buy-in from other people. So, Steve, do you want to start the ball rolling with me?
Okay, I'm going to roll up two questions in one, and I'm aware I want to leave with a very quick question on what you want Welsh Government to do. So just a fair warning on that I want a quick response on that. So I'm going to wrap two in one. One is the housing question of, a lot of the reason why government are talking about this at the moment is because of the impact that the nutrient levels in Sac River catchments is having on the building of social housing in Wales, and therefore we've kind of looked at this issue as a byproduct of the impact that it's having on housing. How useful is that as a way of looking at river health as an overarching goal? And a separate point on NRW. Do you think NRW need more adequate funding in order to carry out their statutory obligations? We know that in this election cycle, at least one party is talking about eradicating NRW as a body, and what kind of impact might that have? So, wrapping those two questions in one, does anyone want to take that on?
I'll jump in quickly. We need an environmental regulator, right? But actually what we do need, and it's pointed to in the Green Paper, is a system planner. Because back to a lot of the challenge we've got here at the moment is looking at this as a system. And that challenge of growth, of course, we need new housing, particularly in rural areas where, the second home challenge, we need people to stay in those communities. We need affordable housing. But we also need the way we manage those systems, because new growth isn't half as much of a problem to me as actually people tarmacking their front gardens to park cars, putting patios down. The lack of impermeable area in our current urban environment is more of a challenge for me running a water network, a wastewater network. And customer per capita consumption of water is going up and up and up. As well. So it's not necessarily growth. It's also about how we manage this as a system.
Okay, right. I'm going to jump on and leave the housing there and maybe you can come back to this. And I'm looking for 30-second responses. Apologies. Of Wales is about to get a new government in some form. What is the one thing you want to see the next Welsh Government do in the area of river health? And I'll go through all of you, and you've each got kind of 30 seconds. You can talk around that, but I'd like one takeaway that the audience can take away. Rodri, I'll bring you in. Sorry, you've had the least time to respond to that.
Yeah, well, we talked about the SFS Sustainable Farming Scheme that is already in place, and I think there's a lot there that if implemented will do good things to rivers. But it's already been touched upon, I think, and I've mentioned before, and what Kate's doing is amazing. But collaborations, what we've done has been because we've collaborated with Woodland Trust, and I haven't gone into the details, but we've got a local community of volunteers who come up and plant the trees through the winter 2 times a week. And they've just been unbelievable. And it's been a sort of spin-off that I hadn't considered when we started doing this. And I don't think I'd have kept going without their help because of how much they get done. So the collaboration with the trust started things, and then the collaboration with volunteers has kicked things on. And then off the back of that, we've sort of had hydrologists within the valley. So one thing I would advocate for is, as a farmer, is I think every farm where possible should have access to an ecologist, a hydrologist, a botanist, an ornithologist. Have people coming out to farms. You're talking about measuring quality of rivers based on water quality. I think you should also be looking at quality of rivers based on biodiversity within those rivers. Our rivers we got brown trout, we got otters, we got all kinds of different animals living in the rivers. However, when I was a kid, it was full of eels, and 95% of British eels have disappeared. My kids have never seen an eel in this river. So there's shifting baselines and changes all the time. But if we're not measuring it, we can't manage it. So I would advocate for, where possible, get that funding to help farmers get educated on what we've already got, and then sympathetically and through collaboration look at ways of actually improving things. And that was more than 30 seconds. Sorry.
But a very good answer, Rodri, if I may say. Okay, who's next? Kate, I'll come to you.
I've got 4 points, so just very succinctly. First, treat our river as an essential national infrastructure that needs to be protected first and foremost. Second, enforce properly. Like, good regulation without the monitoring and consequences just doesn't serve anybody. Third, support farmers, not just in the financial funding of being able to transition, but also in the specialists that Rodri just talked about. And the fourth is invest funds in community groups as partners to deliver and offer localized agency. So I hope that was within 30 seconds.
Absolutely smashed it there, Kate. Yeah. And 4 as well. Really good. Steve.
Support regulators in being braver around nature-based solutions. We need to see more of them go in the ground. I'm still really concerned we're not doing enough to do climate change adaptation. It's always about tighter standards. and we need to think about adapting for a really changing climate.
Brill. Gail.
Yeah, we would like to see a fully integrated catchment response to this, because it's sort of multi-sector, multi-benefit that we can get out of this. I absolutely endorse the comments around enforcement and regulation. There is only one body in Wales that has that role and can do that role, so we need to make sure it's functioning and has the staff and the resources it needs to do it. And my sort of last wish is that the water reform timescales that have been proposed are too long, and we need to move at pace, because we are at a really important point for our rivers at the moment, and if we don't move at pace, we are going to lose species in some of them.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your time and insight. You know what's really nice is we've got these four different perspectives, four very distinct perspectives on river health, and you've all kind of agreed on a lot of the areas of solution, which isn't always the case. So that kind of collaboration at all these different levels has kind of come across for me in the sector. You know, if everyone's singing the same song you like, then that gives momentum for the next Welsh Government to kind of really go ahead and do some of the stuff that you're proposing and put some money behind the solutions that you're all advocating on behalf of. So I want to thank each of the four of you for your time, your insight, your expertise. It's been a really interesting conversation, a critically important topic. As I said before, this webinar will be recorded and put up on the IWA website in the coming days. So keep your eyes peeled on that, and we'll share that, and hopefully you can share it with your networks when it becomes available.